What if I told you that somewhere in the wild, right now, an animal is searching for something? Not food. Not water. Not safety. A feeling. Deep in the ocean, a group of dolphins gathers around a small, quiet creature. They do not eat it. They do not attack it. Instead they pass it between each other, almost like children sharing a strange toy. Afterward something changes. Their movements slow down. Their eyes soften. They seem different. Thousands of miles away, in a snowy forest, a reindeer wanders off from its herd, looking for something bright red hidden beneath the snow. Something it has learned, somehow, will make the world feel different for a while. This is not fiction. It is real behavior, recorded again and again in dozens of species around the planet. Scientists call it animal drug use, and the more they study it, the stranger, and the more human, it starts to look. Tonight we are going to explore this hidden side of nature, one creature at a time. Because somewhere out there, an animal might be doing exactly what you are about to learn, searching for a feeling that has nothing to do with survival at all. Before we meet these animals, a harder question first. Why would any creature shaped by millions of years of survival pressure ever choose something that offers no food, no safety, no clear benefit at all? For a long time, biologists assumed every behavior had to earn its keep. If an animal did something, that something was supposed to help it live longer or reproduce more. Then researchers began noticing something that did not fit. Certain animals, in completely different parts of the world, were seeking out substances that changed how they felt rather than how they functioned. That raised uncomfortable, interesting questions. Do animals get bored? Could a wild creature choose a sensation just because it is interesting? A few researchers think this is one of the more overlooked corners of animal behavior. Others are much more careful, warning against reading human feelings into animal actions. What we do know is that the behavior itself is real, documented and studied for decades. And it starts in the ocean, with one of the most intelligent animals alive. Dolphins are known for their intelligence, complex social lives, playfulness, even recognizing themselves in a mirror. But in 2013, a wildlife film crew caught something on camera that surprised even people who study dolphins for a living. A small group of young dolphins was seen gently passing a pufferfish between them. Pufferfish release a toxin when threatened, one that can kill in large doses. In smaller amounts, it appears to cause something closer to a mild trance. The dolphins did not eat the fish. They handled it carefully, almost delicately, passing it around in a loose circle. Afterward, some of them hovered near the surface, motionless, staring at their own reflection. Marine biologists were split on what they were watching. Some called it unusual play. Others thought it looked closer to deliberate self-intoxication. Either way, the dolphins clearly were not eating something dangerous by accident. They handled it on purpose. And if dolphins were doing this, researchers started to wonder what else might be happening, hidden deep in forests most people never set foot in. In the rainforests of Central and South America, jaguars move through the shadows, one of the most powerful predators on the continent. But every so often, a jaguar does something that has nothing to do with hunting. It goes looking for a specific plant, the yage vine, also known as ayahuasca. It chews the roots slowly, and afterward its whole demeanor shifts, calmer, sometimes almost dazed, rolling on the ground the way a house cat reacts to catnip. Indigenous communities living alongside jaguars have described this behavior for generations, long before any scientist took an interest. Some think the cat is drawn to the plant's strong scent. Others suspect something closer to self-medication. The same plant, prepared differently, has been used by people across the Amazon in spiritual and healing ceremonies for centuries. A jaguar and a human, both drawn to the same vine, is a strange coincidence at best. Scientists still disagree about what exactly the jaguar experiences. What is clear is that it is not eating the plant for food. It does not need to. It wants something else. Far from the rainforest, in the frozen stretches of Siberia and northern Scandinavia, another animal has its own strange relationship with a very different substance. Reindeer seek out a particular mushroom, Amanita muscaria, easy to spot by its bright red cap and white spots. It contains compounds that can produce vivid, dreamlike effects, and in humans it has been used, carefully and sometimes dangerously, for centuries. Reindeer will wander well away from the herd to find it. After eating it, their behavior changes, a bit of stumbling, unusual bursts of energy, sounds they do not normally make. Siberian herders have known this for a long time. Some describe following reindeer tracks specifically to find the mushrooms themselves, trusting that the animals already knew where to look. Oddly, the mushroom's active compounds pass through a reindeer's body largely intact, which means the effect can be experienced a second time through the animal's urine. Some researchers think this detail may be tangled up in old folklore about flying reindeer at winter festivals. Strange as it sounds, this is documented science, not myth. If reindeer and jaguars sound unusual, what happened on the Caribbean island of St. Kitts might be the strangest story of all. Centuries ago, sugarcane fields covered much of the island. Fermented sugarcane left over from early rum production pooled naturally in the fields, and the local vervet monkeys found it. Over generations, these monkeys built a real relationship with alcohol, unlike anything seen in other primate populations. Researchers eventually found their drinking habits mirrored human ones almost exactly. Most drank occasionally and in moderation. A smaller group avoided it almost entirely. And a smaller group still drank heavily, repeatedly, almost compulsively. This became a genuinely important discovery in addiction research. Scientists realized these monkeys could work as a natural model for understanding why some individuals, animal or human, are far more vulnerable to addiction than others. Access was not the deciding factor. Every monkey had the same opportunity. The difference sat somewhere in individual biology. For the first time, researchers had stumbled onto a wild experiment that nature had apparently been running for hundreds of years. While the monkeys were making headlines in the Caribbean, a quieter story was unfolding much closer to ordinary backyards. Certain birds, cedar waxwings and robins in particular, have occasionally been seen acting strangely after gorging on overripe, fermented berries in autumn, flying unevenly, losing their balance on branches, sitting unusually still for long stretches. In a few documented cases, whole flocks were affected after feeding at the same fruit source, leading to scenes of visibly disoriented birds. Wildlife rescue centers sometimes take in birds that temporarily cannot fly straight, and simply need time to sleep it off before release. Unlike dolphins, jaguars, or monkeys, most researchers think this bird behavior is accidental. Birds go for the sugar in ripe fruit, not the alcohol, which just happens to form naturally as fruit ferments in warm weather. Still, the effect on their coordination looks a lot like what happens in animals believed to seek these substances out deliberately. Where exactly is the line between an accident and a genuine want? That question leads somewhere bigger. So why would nature allow this pattern to exist at all? Across oceans, forests, islands, and backyards, unrelated species keep circling back toward substances that alter how they feel. Some scientists propose what is sometimes called the intoxication hypothesis, that altered mental states might occasionally offer a subtle evolutionary edge, maybe encouraging exploration, cutting stress, or strengthening bonds within a group. Others lean toward simpler explanations. Curiosity. Sensory pleasure. The same brain chemistry that rewards humans for seeking out pleasurable experiences may exist, in some form, in plenty of other species too. There is also a self-medication theory, especially around jaguars and certain plants, the idea that some animals instinctively use natural compounds to ease pain, calm anxiety, or fight off parasites. No single theory explains every case here. Each species seems to have its own reason, shaped by its own environment and biology. What stays consistent is the pattern itself. Nature keeps producing animals willing to seek out an altered state of mind, in wildly different corners of the world. Even after decades of research, scientists still cannot say for certain what is happening inside these animals' minds. Do they feel pleasure the way we do? Do they connect the plant to the feeling that follows it? There is a real limitation here. Animals cannot describe what they experience. Every conclusion has to be inferred from behavior, which leaves plenty of room for disagreement. Some researchers warn against reading too much into it, since projecting human emotion onto animals can lead scientists astray. Others argue that dismissing the behavior outright risks missing something real about animal cognition. New research keeps trickling in. Advances in neuroscience are slowly letting scientists study animal brain activity more closely than ever, which might eventually clear some of this up. For now, the honest answer is that we do not fully know. And maybe that uncertainty is part of what makes this whole thing so interesting. Nature is still keeping secrets, even from the people who study it most closely. Picture the dolphins once more, drifting near the surface, calm under a wide, quiet sky. Somewhere in a snowy forest, a reindeer rests after its strange winter wandering. In a warm rainforest, a jaguar lies still beneath wide green leaves. Nature is stranger than we usually give it credit for. Across oceans and forests, animals large and small keep reaching for something beyond survival, a feeling, a sensation, a moment that is simply different. Maybe that says something about curiosity running deeper into the animal kingdom than we assumed. Or maybe it is just one more thread tying us to the wild world around us. Either way, let the images sit for a moment. Dolphins drifting. Reindeer sleeping. Jaguars resting under quiet leaves, the wild world carrying on exactly as it always has. Long before dolphins and jaguars entered this story, one animal had already become famous, somewhat unfairly, for something it may never have actually done. Elephants in parts of Africa have long been rumored to get drunk on fermented marula fruit that falls to the ground. The story spread widely for years, showing up in documentaries and magazine articles. But when scientists finally ran the numbers, they did not add up. An elephant's body size would require an almost impossible amount of fermented fruit to feel any effect at all. Researchers now think the wobbling, stumbling elephants in old footage were more likely reacting to something else entirely, possibly a toxin from certain bark beetles that sometimes turn up in the same fruit. It is a useful correction to sit with. Not every catchy animal story turns out to be true, even the convincing ones. And sorting fact from myth matters even more with the next animal, one found much further south, hopping through fields most people would never suspect. In Tasmania, wallabies live near large, legally grown poppy fields cultivated for pharmaceutical medicine. Farmers started noticing something strange, circular, flattened patches showing up in their crops, like small crop circles. The cause turned out to be wallabies. Drawn to the opium poppies, they would eat the plants, wander in slow, disoriented circles, then collapse into a light sleep, flattening a ring of crop around themselves. Local officials confirmed the story publicly, calling it an unusual but genuine side effect of farming near wildlife. The wallabies were not harmed, just briefly affected, and wandered off once it passed. The story caught on worldwide, partly because it felt charming rather than alarming, a wild animal stumbling into an altered state through sheer proximity to human agriculture, rather than actively going looking for it the way jaguars or reindeer seem to. It leaves an open question. How much of this whole pattern is animals genuinely seeking something out, and how much is just opportunity meeting curiosity? Dogs have their own strange chapter here too, and it involves an unlikely source, certain toads found in the southwestern United States and Australia. The Sonoran desert toad and the invasive cane toad both secrete a defensive substance through their skin when threatened, one capable of producing strong, altered effects. Vets have documented dogs deliberately licking or mouthing these toads again and again, despite obvious discomfort during the experience. This puzzled researchers for a while. Unlike a jaguar calmly seeking out a plant, toad licking often looks agitated, even risky, sometimes landing the dog in the vet's office. Yet dogs keep going back to the same toad, which suggests something about the experience keeps pulling them in despite the unpleasant side effects. Some veterinary behaviorists compare this loosely to compulsive behavior, though the comparison is debated. Whatever the explanation, it is a reminder that seeking an altered state does not always look calm. Sometimes it looks messy and hard to explain. Cats offer a gentler, far more familiar version of this same story, one plenty of pet owners have watched firsthand without ever framing it this way. Catnip, an ordinary garden plant, triggers unmistakable behavioral changes in most house cats. Rolling, rubbing, purring, bursts of playful energy followed by a dreamy stillness. Scientists eventually identified the compound responsible, nepentolactone, and found it binds to receptors in a cat's nose, triggering a response that looks a lot like certain pleasure pathways in other mammals. Not every cat reacts to catnip, though. Roughly a third show no response at all, a difference tied to genetics rather than personality. It echoes what researchers found earlier in the Caribbean vervet monkeys, individual biology shaping how strongly, or weakly, a creature responds to the same substance. It is an ordinary example sitting on millions of windowsills, proof that this whole pattern is not confined to distant jungles or frozen forests. Let us rest here a moment. A wide, open meadow at dusk, the last light fading behind distant hills. Tall grass sways in a light evening breeze, undisturbed. This story, unfolding across oceans, forests, deserts, and backyards, moves at its own pace, one discovery at a time. The meadow settles further into evening stillness, crickets starting their chorus in the deepening shadows. There is more of this to explore, a few more creatures waiting in the parts ahead. Maybe the most surprising research in this whole field does not come from a mammal at all, but from the common fruit fly. In lab studies, scientists found that fruit flies infected with parasitic wasp larvae would deliberately seek out food laced with alcohol, something rarely seen in healthy, uninfected flies. Researchers eventually figured out why. The alcohol proved toxic to the developing wasp larvae inside the fly, effectively working as a form of self-medication. The infected flies were, in a real sense, treating themselves, with a substance most people associate purely with human recreation. This discovery stunned scientists. A creature with a brain far simpler than a dolphin's or a jaguar's still showed behavior that looked purposeful, even protective. It shifted how a lot of researchers think about this whole subject, away from simple pleasure seeking and toward a broader idea, that certain substances might offer real biological benefit across a surprisingly wide range of species, tiny brains included. Primates besides the St. Kitts monkeys have their own strange stories. In Madagascar, certain lemur species have been seen handling toxic millipedes deliberately, biting them gently to release a mild chemical irritant, then rubbing it across their own fur. For years, researchers assumed this was purely a natural insect repellent, since the released chemicals do seem to deter mosquitoes. But closer observation turned up something else underneath it. After handling the millipedes, lemurs sometimes drop into a brief, glassy-eyed, almost trance-like stillness for several minutes. That raised an interesting possibility. The behavior might serve two purposes at once: practical insect protection layered under a secondary effect the lemurs may have also learned to seek out. Separating practical benefit from deliberate pleasure seeking is genuinely hard in cases like this. The line between an animal solving a problem and an animal enjoying the process gets blurry fast. Even the ocean has one more surprise in store, this time from one of its most famously unusual creatures, the octopus. In a widely cited 2018 study, researchers exposed octopuses to a compound related to MDMA, known in humans for increasing feelings of social openness. Octopuses are typically solitary, often avoiding contact with each other entirely. After exposure, that changed noticeably. The octopuses spent far more time near one another, sometimes even reaching out to touch. Scientists found this fascinating partly because octopus brains evolved along a completely separate path from human brains, branching off hundreds of millions of years ago. Finding a shared chemical response across such different nervous systems hints at a biological pathway for social bonding that might run more universally through the animal kingdom than anyone assumed. It is one of the more remarkable pieces of evidence in this whole story, a sign that whatever drives this pattern might reach back further into evolutionary history than expected. Stepping back, it is worth remembering humans are not exactly separate from this story either. Long before modern science, early human communities on nearly every continent independently found plants, fungi, and fermented substances that alter mood and perception, and worked them carefully into ritual, medicine, and social life. Some researchers wonder whether early humans partly learned certain practices by watching animals first, noticing which plants attracted particular creatures, then investigating those same plants themselves. The idea has a name, zoopharmacognosy, and it remains an active area of research. Whether or not animals actually guided early human discovery, the deeper connection feels hard to miss. Humans are not entirely outside the natural world here. We might just be one more species drawn toward this same old, curious pull. It is a humbling thought to sit with halfway through tonight's story. This section has covered a fair amount of ground: elephants and a myth finally corrected, wallabies wandering through poppy fields, dogs and toads, cats and catnip, fruit flies treating their own infections, lemurs and millipedes, octopuses reaching toward connection, and humans woven into this same old pattern. The picture keeps growing richer with every thread, stretching wider across the animal kingdom than most people would expect from one quiet evening story. For now, picture that same wide meadow again, grass settled under a darkening sky, crickets still singing. There is more of this ahead. Bees carry their own small version of this story too. On warm, humid days, certain flowers produce nectar that starts fermenting naturally while still on the plant, picking up small traces of alcohol before a bee ever arrives. Researchers studying colonies noticed something odd. Bees that drank this fermented nectar sometimes flew less accurately afterward, struggling to land or find their way back to the hive. Other bees in the colony seemed to notice, occasionally blocking the disoriented ones from entering, almost like a built-in checkpoint protecting the wider hive. That discovery pointed to something like colony-level awareness of impairment, a social structure quietly managing the accidental fallout of fermented nectar. Unlike jaguars or reindeer, bees are not believed to seek this out on purpose. But the story still fits, another reminder that altered states, however they arrive, ripple outward beyond just the individual affected. High in the mountains of North America, bighorn sheep have a habit that puzzled wildlife researchers for years before anyone understood it. Sheep were seen grinding their teeth down to unusual, worn stubs against certain rock surfaces, seemingly on purpose. It turned out these rocks were coated in a specific lichen with mild psychoactive compounds. The sheep were deliberately scraping it off with their teeth, wearing them down far beyond anything normal grazing would cause. That comes at a real cost. Badly worn teeth can shorten a sheep's life considerably, making it harder to feed later on. Yet the sheep kept doing it anyway, as if whatever the lichen offered was worth the long-term trade-off. This case stands out because it shows an animal accepting lasting harm for a temporary altered experience, uncomfortably close to certain human behaviors around substances. It is one of the more sobering threads in an otherwise curious story. Horses sometimes cross paths with mind-altering plants too, most notably a group called locoweed, found across parts of the western United States. Unlike most cases here, locoweed poisoning is generally considered accidental. But researchers noticed something unusual. Horses that had eaten it once sometimes kept seeking it out afterward, even with better grazing nearby, developing something that looked like a genuine ongoing preference despite the plant's clear, harmful effect on their nervous system. Vets studying this describe it almost as a compulsive pull, hard to explain through ordinary grazing alone. Some researchers think the plant's compounds may interact with reward pathways in the horse's brain, similar in principle to addictive substances in humans. It blurs the line between accident and intention again, a behavior that starts by chance and can turn into something that looks a lot like real preference, regardless of the cost. Zoos and sanctuaries have added their own piece to this story, particularly around a concept called environmental enrichment. Captive animals, missing the natural challenges of the wild, sometimes develop unusual behaviors, occasionally including a strong pull toward mildly stimulating plants offered as part of structured enrichment. Big cats in captivity are sometimes given controlled access to catnip or similar plants specifically to encourage natural investigative behavior and cut stress. Caretakers report genuine psychological benefit, similar to how the plant affects house cats. That raises a question researchers keep coming back to. If captivity itself increases interest in these substances, does boredom play a bigger role in this whole pattern than anyone assumed, at least for species living outside truly wild conditions? It adds another layer of nuance to an already complicated picture. Let us pause again. A quiet forest clearing at early dusk, tall trees casting long shadows over fallen leaves. Nearby, a small stream moves slowly over smooth stones, barely making a sound. This exploration keeps unfolding gently, one discovery layered after another. The forest settles further into evening calm, birdsong fading into the deepening quiet, leaving only water drifting over stone. A little more of this pattern is still ahead. Back to the dolphins that opened this story. Researchers have kept studying their pufferfish handling behavior in the years since that first viral footage. Later observations suggest the behavior may not be as rare as first assumed, just hard to catch given how much dolphin activity happens beneath the surface, out of human view. Some marine biologists now think this might connect to broader dolphin social bonding, similar to how the octopus study found increased social interest after exposure to certain compounds. If true, it ties dolphins even closer to that same wider thread linking altered states to social connection across very different species. Other researchers stay cautious, since separating deliberate intoxication seeking from simple play is genuinely hard in a species this curious and intelligent. What began as one striking clip has since turned into an ongoing area of patient research, one more case of a single observation quietly reshaping scientific curiosity for years. Certain ants have their own strange, fungal chapter, though it unfolds quite differently from everything else here. Specific fungi can infect ants and gradually steer their behavior in ways that benefit the fungus, not the ant. Infected ants wander off their usual paths, sometimes climbing to unusual heights before the fungus finishes its life cycle. This is not deliberate substance seeking on the ant's part, but it makes a useful contrast, a reminder that not every case of altered behavior comes from a creature choosing something for itself. Sometimes nature runs the opposite direction, with an outside organism quietly pulling the strings for its own purposes. Comparing this against the deliberate, self-directed behavior in dolphins or jaguars sharpens what actually makes those earlier cases remarkable. Not everything that looks similar on the surface shares the same cause underneath. Putting all of this together, a clearer picture starts to form. Some animals, like the fruit flies and lemurs, seem to get a real practical benefit. Others, like the vervet monkeys and dolphins, seem to be chasing pure sensation or connection. Some, like the bighorn sheep, keep going despite a real cost. Others, like the bees with their fermenting nectar, just stumble into it. There is no single, tidy explanation that covers every case. Nature rarely hands out one simple answer when a messier, layered truth is available instead. What ties every story together here is not a shared reason but a shared pattern, altered states showing up again and again across wildly different species and circumstances, echoing each other loosely across the animal kingdom. Scientists are still very much in the middle of figuring this one out. One more quiet pause before gathering the last of tonight's threads. The same forest clearing, now fully dark, moonlight filtering through the branches. The stream keeps its slow, steady pace over smooth stone. Further off, the wide meadow from earlier rests just as calmly, tall grass barely stirring. We have covered real ground tonight, from oceans to mountains to quiet garden windowsills. Only a little is left before this section comes to rest. This section moved from fermenting nectar and cautious bees, to bighorn sheep paying a steep price for a strange mountain lichen, to horses developing an unexpected pull toward a harmful plant, to captive animals and the role boredom might play, to ants steered by fungus rather than choice, and finally to the layered picture all of these stories build together. The night stays calm, the forest clearing quiet, the meadow settled beneath a gentle sky, everything unfolding at its own pace. A little ground remains before this exploration reaches its close. Capuchin monkeys, close relatives of the St. Kitts vervets, have their own separate ritual worth mentioning, one that is not quite intoxication in the usual sense. Capuchins rub crushed millipedes, certain plants, or other strong-smelling substances directly onto their fur, a behavior researchers call self-anointing. Unlike the lemurs from earlier, capuchins seem to choose their materials specifically for scent, sometimes going for strongly aromatic plants with mild psychoactive properties. Some troops have even used citrus or onions when nothing stronger is around, suggesting the ritual itself, shared communally, might matter as much as any particular substance. Whole troops sometimes gather for extended anointing sessions, rubbing against each other in a way that strengthens social bonds while also deterring insects, practical benefit and altered sensation tangled together once again. Birds come back into this story through a different substance than the fermented berries mentioned earlier. Where wild tobacco grows, certain bird species have been seen deliberately lining their nests with the leaves, a discovery that puzzled researchers when it was first documented. At first scientists assumed it was purely practical, since tobacco leaves contain compounds that repel parasites and mites common in bird nests. Further study confirmed this. Nests lined with tobacco had noticeably fewer harmful insects. But researchers also noticed something else. Birds handling fresh tobacco leaves occasionally went briefly still or moved strangely, hinting at a secondary effect beyond pest control. Whether the birds are aware of, or actually drawn to, that secondary effect is genuinely unclear. Practical benefit and subtle altered sensation, tangled together yet again. Sea slugs, quiet and easy to overlook, hold a small place in this story too. Certain species feed on toxic algae or coral and store the toxic compounds in their own bodies instead of being harmed by them. Mostly this is understood as defense, borrowing toxicity from a food source to deter predators. But some researchers studying sea slug behavior have noted unusual movement patterns after feeding on particularly potent algae, patterns that simple defense does not fully explain. This area of research trails far behind dolphin or primate studies, mostly because sea slugs are hard to observe closely in the wild. Still, their inclusion shows how far this pattern potentially reaches, down into some of the ocean's smallest, quietest corners. Let us pause again. A quiet coastal shoreline at dusk, waves rolling onto smooth sand and pulling back a moment later. Further along the shore, seabirds settle in for the evening, huddled against a light ocean breeze. This story has carried us across oceans, forests, deserts, mountains, and now coastlines, each thread adding its own small piece to a much larger picture. The shoreline keeps its slow rhythm, waves arriving and retreating without hurry. A little ground remains before this section closes. The field studying all of this has its own name, zoopharmacognosy, animals self-medicating using natural substances in their environment. It has grown considerably over recent decades, moving from scattered observations towards something more organized. Researchers in this field often work closely with indigenous communities, whose knowledge of local plants and animal behavior frequently predates formal science by generations. Some of the clearest cases in this whole story, especially the jaguars and the reindeer, were first recorded by local communities who understood the behavior long before any scientist arrived to study it formally. That collaboration between traditional knowledge and modern research has become genuinely valued, sitting comfortably alongside lab work and controlled observation. Ethical questions come up in this field too, and researchers take them seriously. Deliberately exposing animals to intoxicating substances for study raises real welfare concerns, so many scientists lean toward careful field observation instead of controlled lab exposure wherever possible. The octopus study mentioned earlier went through considerable ethical review beforehand, careful dosing, and close monitoring throughout, reflecting the standards now expected across this kind of research. Scientists studying the jaguar and yage-vine relationship, by contrast, generally avoid any direct intervention at all, just watching behavior that is already happening on its own. That careful approach shows how much the field has matured since the early, more casual observations that first grabbed public attention decades ago. Popular culture has picked up threads of this story too, sometimes accurately, sometimes exaggerated for entertainment. Documentaries, magazine pieces, and viral clips have introduced millions of people to the dolphins and their pufferfish, though not always with the full scientific context attached. That creates a real tension for researchers, balancing genuine curiosity against the need for accurate communication. Some scientists welcome the attention as a chance to introduce broader audiences to legitimate research. Others stay wary, worried that oversimplified stories crowd out the nuance the actual research requires. Tonight's story has tried to walk that same line, sharing these accounts while staying honest about where the science ends and the debate begins. One more quiet pause before gathering the last threads together. The coastal shoreline again, fully dark now, moonlight scattered across the rolling waves. Further inland, the forest clearing and the wide meadow rest just as peacefully, unchanged since we last visited them. We have traveled a long way tonight, from dolphins and jaguars to reindeer and monkeys, through bees, sheep, ants, and quiet coastal sea slugs. Each thread has added its own small piece. Only a little ground remains before this journey rests. This section moved from Capuchins and their communal anointing rituals, to birds lining nests with tobacco, to sea slugs quietly carrying borrowed toxins along the coast, to magpies and their possible memory for fermenting fruit, to the science and ethics guiding this field today, and finally to how this story has traveled into popular culture. The night stays calm, the coastline quiet, the forest clearing and meadows settled beneath a star-scattered sky. A little ground remains ahead. Deer, close relatives of the reindeer from earlier, play out their own version of this pattern much further south, in temperate orchards and wild apple groves across North America and Europe. In autumn, windfall apples on the ground begin fermenting naturally in the cooling air. Deer feeding heavily on these apples sometimes act noticeably differently, stumbling gently, moving with unusual hesitation, standing still for long stretches. Wildlife photographers have caught this more than once, often mistaking it at first for illness before realizing the stranger, more ordinary explanation. Unlike reindeer deliberately hunting down a specific mushroom, deer seem to run into this by accident, drawn by the sweet smell of fermenting fruit rather than any specific altering property. The resulting behavior still looks remarkably similar, though, another echo running through this larger story. Deer, close relatives of the reindeer from earlier, play out their own version of this pattern much further south, in temperate orchards and wild apple groves across North America and Europe. In autumn, windfall apples on the ground begin fermenting naturally in the cooling air. Deer feeding heavily on these apples sometimes act noticeably differently, stumbling gently, moving with unusual hesitation, standing still for long stretches. Wildlife photographers have caught this more than once, often mistaking it at first for illness before realizing the stranger, more ordinary explanation. Unlike reindeer deliberately hunting down a specific mushroom, deer seem to run into this by accident, drawn by the sweet smell of fermenting fruit rather than any specific altering property. The resulting behavior still looks remarkably similar, though, another echo running through this larger story. Parrots, known for intelligence and long lifespans, have their own small place here too, tied to a specific seed in South America known locally for its strong effect on wildlife. Certain parrot species seek these seeds out deliberately, cracking them open before eating the contents. Researchers noted temporary changes afterward, unusually loud, exaggerated calls and brief spells of poor coordination. Because parrots live in large, complex flocks, some researchers wonder if this behavior carries a social component, similar to what was suggested earlier with octopuses and dolphins, potentially reinforcing bonds within the flock. This research is still fairly early compared to studies in primates or dolphins, though interest in the behavior has been growing given how complex parrot social structures already appear to be. Stepping back, it is worth noticing something shared across nearly every species in this story, a biological thread running underneath very different behaviors. Almost all the substances involved, whether from plants, fungi, fermentation, or animal secretions, interact with strikingly similar neurological pathways across very different species. That similarity suggests these reward pathways evolved extremely early, probably before mammals, birds, and octopuses branched off onto their own separate evolutionary paths. Rather than each species building its own unique system from scratch, it looks more like this basic framework was inherited, then shaped a little differently over an enormous stretch of time. That helps explain why animals separated by hundreds of millions of years of evolution can still respond in strikingly similar ways to broadly similar compounds. Human medicine owes a real debt to some of these same behaviors. Researchers studying zoopharmacognosy have occasionally used animal self-medication as a starting point for investigating new treatments, watching which plants animals seek out when unwell, then studying those same plants more closely in the lab. Several existing medicines can trace part of their discovery back to careful observation of animal behavior in the wild, though confirming a compound's medical usefulness still takes extensive lab work well beyond simple observation. This growing field, sometimes called biomimicry more broadly, keeps expanding as researchers realize how much practical insight nature has already been demonstrating for generations. It is a hopeful, practical thread running through an otherwise purely curious story, suggesting these strange animal behaviors might eventually offer real benefit well beyond the animal kingdom. Let us pause again. A quiet orchard in early autumn, rows of apple trees stretching into the distance, fallen fruit scattered across dew-covered grass. A light mist hovers low, catching the first early light on the horizon. This story has carried us across nearly every corner of the natural world by now: oceans, forests, deserts, mountains, coastlines, and orchards too. The orchard settles further into morning stillness, birdsong starting softly among the branches. A little ground remains before this section closes. Bonobos, close genetic relatives of chimpanzees and humans, add one last primate thread, one researchers find especially compelling given how closely bonobo social structures resemble parts of human society. Bonobos have been seen eating fermented fruit in their forest habitat, showing mild behavioral changes afterward similar to other primates in this story. What sets bonobos apart is their unusually strong emphasis on social bonding and conflict resolution compared to other great apes. Some researchers wonder whether mild fermented fruit consumption plays a small supporting role in those already elaborate social rituals, though that idea stays fairly cautious and exploratory rather than firmly established. Given how closely bonobos are related to us, their inclusion here is one of the more thought-provoking comparisons in tonight's story. Given everything gathered so far, it is worth sitting with one question researchers keep circling back to. Is this pattern, altered states showing up across such a wide range of unrelated species, something evolution built on purpose, or just an inevitable side effect of how nervous systems happen to be built? Some researchers lean toward the idea that reward pathways, which evolved to encourage useful behaviors like eating or socializing, simply create an unavoidable vulnerability to substances that trigger those same pathways artificially. Under that view, animals are not necessarily seeking altered states specifically, just stumbling into a side effect of how reward already works biologically. Others point to the consistency and deliberateness in cases like the jaguars or reindeer as evidence that something more intentional is going on, closer to actual choice than pure biological accident. Neither view has fully won out. Maybe, as with most of this story, the honest answer includes a bit of both. As this exploration nears its close, it is worth circling back to the octopus study once more, since it captures something meaningful about the whole subject. An animal separated from humans by hundreds of millions of years of evolution, with an entirely different kind of nervous system, still responded to a compound tied to social connection in a way that looked remarkably human. That single detail hints at something bigger running through this whole story. Whatever drives this pattern, curiosity, pleasure, self-medication, or plain biological accident, it seems to reach deep into the shared evolutionary history connecting nearly every animal covered tonight, humans included. It is a humbling reminder that despite huge differences in size, intelligence, and habitat, a lot of creatures on this planet might be connected by something surprisingly similar happening under the surface. One more quiet pause before gathering the last threads of this long story. The orchard again, now lit by soft morning light, mist lifting off the grass. Further off, the coastal shoreline, the forest clearing, and the wide meadow all rest just as peacefully, each one quietly connected by the same unhurried story we have followed tonight. We have covered a huge amount of ground, from dolphins and jaguars all the way through bonobos, parrots, and fermenting orchards. Only a little remains before this journey rests completely. This section moved from deer stumbling gently through fermenting orchards, to parrots and their curious seeds, to the shared neurological pathways connecting nearly every species in this story, to medicine quietly inspired by animal observation, to bonobos and their social bonds, and finally to the unresolved question of choice versus biological accident. The world stays calm, the orchard settled under early morning light, every scene from tonight resting peacefully, connected by the same slow thread running through this whole exploration. A little ground remains ahead. Spiders offer one of the most visually striking pieces of evidence in this whole field, thanks to a series of classic experiments from decades ago. Researchers exposed spiders to small amounts of various substances, then compared the webs they built afterward against each spider's normal structure. The results were remarkable. Webs built under the influence became noticeably distorted, sometimes wildly irregular, with uneven spacing and broken symmetry. Different substances produced distinctly different patterns, giving researchers an unusually clear, visual window into how various compounds affected coordination and focus. This research gets cited constantly because it offers something rare here, a direct, visible record of an altered state, left behind in the physical structure the spider built. Where most cases in this story rely on judging temporary movement or behavior, a distorted web just sits there, quiet evidence. A much more modern and considerably more troubling chapter has emerged in recent years, involving fish living in waterways near densely populated areas. Researchers studying rivers downstream from cities found detectable traces of cocaine and other substances in the water itself, residue traced back to human waste entering the system. Fish in these waterways showed measurable exposure, with some studies documenting shifts in social behavior and activity levels. Unlike almost every other case in this story, there is no deliberate seeking behavior here at all, just unintended exposure caused entirely by human activity. Researchers treat this as a serious environmental concern rather than a curious natural behavior, a sobering reminder that not every thread here reflects nature's own design. Sometimes human impact quietly reshapes the natural world in ways we are only starting to understand. In eastern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, a plant called khat grows widely, containing mild stimulant compounds long used in certain human cultural traditions. Wildlife researchers in these regions have occasionally documented elephants and other grazing animals deliberately seeking out wild khat, despite it offering little obvious nutrition compared to surrounding vegetation. This adds an interesting layer to the earlier elephant question, since it suggests elephants might have a genuine, independent relationship with mood-altering plants after all, separate from the marula fruit myth that scientists eventually disproved. Researchers stay cautious here, given how limited direct field observation still is. Still, it is a promising thread for future research, one that could bring elephants back into this story on considerably firmer scientific footing than the earlier, now largely debunked legend. Sloths, famous for their slow, deliberate movement, have a small, gentle place in this story too, tied again to naturally fermenting plant material in their forest canopy homes. Certain leaves favored by sloths occasionally ferment slightly while still on the tree, especially during warm, humid stretches. Researchers studying sloth behavior have noted periods of even greater stillness than usual after eating these slightly fermented leaves, though given how slow sloths already move, the effect is genuinely hard to measure with much confidence. This case is one of the more uncertain, lightly studied threads in the whole story, included here mostly as a curious footnote rather than a firm finding. Not every observation in careful research reaches a clean conclusion, worth remembering as we near the end of tonight's exploration. Let us pause again. A warm rainforest canopy at dusk, thick green leaves catching the last light of the day, shadows stretching across the forest floor far below. Somewhere high above, a sloth stays perfectly still, exactly as it always is. This story has now carried us across nearly every environment imaginable: oceans, forests, deserts, mountains, coastlines, orchards, and rainforest canopies too. The canopy settles further into evening stillness, insects starting their quiet chorus below. Across nearly every human culture, mythology and folklore have occasionally tied animals and altered states together in fascinating, sometimes startlingly accurate ways. We touched on reindeer folklore around winter festivals earlier, but similar threads show up elsewhere too, stories of animals guiding early humans towards certain healing plants, or folklore explaining unusual animal behavior through spirits rather than chemistry. Modern science has since replaced many of those older explanations with clearer, evidence-based understanding, yet the observations behind them often turn out to be surprisingly accurate, just explained differently than earlier generations understood. That pattern, careful storytelling later confirmed by modern research, shows up again and again in this story. Long before formal science existed, people were noticing real patterns in the natural world, even without fully understanding why. Looking at the full scope of everything gathered here, one theme stands out clearly above the rest. This pattern is not confined to a single environment, species, or type of substance. It shows up in oceans and forests, deserts and mountains, tiny insects and massive elephants, simple reflex and deliberate, repeated choice. Some cases clearly serve a practical purpose: self-medication, insect protection, social bonding. Others stay genuinely mysterious, resistant to easy explanation despite plenty of scientific attention. A few, like the fish exposed to human pollution, remind us that not every thread here reflects nature's own design at all. Taken together, this diversity says something worth sitting with. Nature rarely offers simple, universal answers. It offers countless small, individual stories instead, each shaped by its own history and biology, rhyming loosely without ever fully repeating. As we near the end of this long exploration, it is worth circling back to where the story began, dolphins gently passing a small pufferfish between each other beneath the ocean's surface. What started as one striking piece of footage slowly unfolded into an entire hidden world, stretching across nearly every corner of the animal kingdom. Jaguars and ancient forest plants. Reindeer wandering through snow toward bright red mushrooms. Monkeys drinking quietly in Caribbean sugarcane fields. Octopuses reaching toward connection. Spiders leaving behind strange, distorted webs as physical evidence of an altered state. Each thread on its own might look like a curious, isolated oddity. Gathered together across this whole story, they add up to something bigger, a hidden pattern running beneath the surface of the natural world, largely unnoticed until tonight. One more quiet pause before gathering the very last pieces of this story. The rainforest canopy again, fully dark now, moonlight scattered through gaps in the thick leaves above. Far below, the forest floor sits in complete stillness. Every scene we have visited tonight, the ocean's surface, the snowy forest, the sugarcane fields, the wide meadow, the quiet orchard, all rest now in that same unhurried stillness, connected by the single patient thread running through this whole exploration. Only a little ground remains before we bring this story completely to its close. This final section moved from spiders leaving distorted webs behind as evidence, to fish unintentionally affected by human pollution, to elephants possibly reconnecting with this story through a very different plant than once believed, to uncertain footnotes involving sloths, to old folklore quietly confirmed by modern science, and finally to the full, sprawling picture this whole exploration has built. The natural world stays calm and unhurried, every scene from tonight resting together beneath the same wide sky, connected by curiosity, biology, and countless small stories still not fully understood. Only a little remains before this journey reaches its close. And so, gently, we arrive at the end of this long journey. We began in silence, watching dolphins pass a small pufferfish between each other beneath the ocean's surface, and we have spent all this time since uncovering just how far this strange pattern reaches. Jaguars in the rainforest. Reindeer in the snow. Monkeys in the sugarcane. Spiders leaving distorted webs behind as evidence. Elephants, once wrongly accused, quietly returning to this story through a very different plant. Octopuses reaching toward connection across hundreds of millions of years of separate evolution. Nature holds more curiosity and complexity than most of us stop to consider. Somewhere out there tonight, under a sky none of us can see, this same old pattern keeps unfolding, largely unnoticed, exactly as it always has. Picture, one last time, that same wide meadow, grass settled and still beneath a gentle night sky, crickets singing softly in the dark. Let that image rest in your mind as we close. Thank you for spending this long, calm evening with us. If this journey through nature's strangest secrets helped you relax and unwind, consider liking the video, subscribing for more slow, thoughtful stories like this one, and sharing your own thoughts in the comments. Sleep peacefully, and good night.